Welcome to episode 28 of Radical Priorities. I'm Aidan Clark.
I'm Ben Parkins.
There's sort of very sad news to start the episode off with. Also very difficult news, perhaps to describe. Two people were gunned down, two staff members of the Israeli embassy in Washington, D.C., by a person who was recorded saying not long after the murders, "Free Palestine." And I would say just as this conflict was maybe not ending, in fact, in certain senses, it's intensifying, this sort of last push before it almost collapses as a sort of geopolitically accepted event. You have these obviously needless murders that just draw undue levels of attention and violence and re-engage the conflict as a cultural and political touchstone well outside of the confines of the conflict, once again into violence. And I mean, looking at the situation, I mean, Britain, France, and Canada just signed, okay, finally, sure, 2 years after the event, some statement to the effect of saying we'll do something maybe about it. And you have this strange news with, of course, Trump's own staffers going behind his back and trying to negotiate for whatever concessions can be had from the Americans in favor of specifically Netanyahu's administration, who have been pummeling and pushing this war since it began, and yet, nonetheless, maybe the only possible light in the situation is that because it's a sort of form of violence happening domestically, not necessarily in the conflict itself, but happening in the quote-unquote centers of power, it might be the swan song, as it were, of a certain degree of violence. But it's a worthy opportunity, I think, maybe a very necessary opportunity to talk about the conflict and maybe to try and narrativize a little bit where we are with respect to the conflict. And I think from the very beginning, how I've seen the conflict, it's been one where there's been a frustration on the Israelis' part with the liberal answer to ethnicity, to the state, to integration, to the two-state solution. And the events of October 7th basically provided the ultimate push or a motivation to sort of explode the naive liberal contract of multiculturalism getting along together. And obviously, long before October 7th, this contract had already reached an extraordinary impasse in Israel. So it's not a surprise, maybe, that there was already an implicit rejection of it. But, this goes hand in hand as well with, really the most recent news with the Trump administration of this divergence, between, Trump's concept of trying to end the conflict and an ongoing attachment to, well, no, this is the opportunity to establish a state we've never seen before, a state that is, genuinely an ethnic state that doesn't necessarily have room for everyone else. Liberalism, liberal democracy, even to an extent, liberal capitalism has been unable to provide a solid ground for the operations of the state. And in many ways, the Middle East has been, for decades, kind of the symptom of the collapse of the global liberal agenda. And this is to be distinguished in a way from whatever Trump is trying to build, which is this state, a little bit that seems to be less of an ethno-state, but no less of an attempt to demolish the naive liberal contract. And if I tell sort of this political story, it's to provide some schematic for what I would wish that supporters of Palestine, whoever they may be, would take up instead of obviously lethal arms, but also a kind of blanket support for say in the case of Hamas, an administration, if you can call it that is not in any way able to come to a solution, does not have an answer, and far from being a kind of Greta Thunberg-esque kind of political rejection of all existing solutions seems to me just to be the ultimate fossil of the failed, of the impasse of the last 60 or 70 years, which no one in the international community has solved, and which, to an extent, even humanitarian pleas to solve it have been unsuccessful, because, let's be honest, the impasse itself of Israel and Palestine is an impasse of human rights politics. In other words, it's not as if we don't have, it's not like, oh, we need more human rights politics. If anything, that very concept of internationalism was not only rejected by the Israelis themselves, but maybe on the whole is an impossible contract. And again, the advice I would give to the Palestinians and supporters of Palestine would be, one should almost, in a weird way, join Israel in rejecting the naive liberal contract, because human rights and categories of internationalism have failed, largely because they've been undermined by global forces that have had less to do with multiculturalism and more to do with, I mean, the global power of finance and industry, and most recently tech. And the defense industry is, of course, regrettably a supreme part of that. And in other words, rather than trying to negotiate this conflict as if we just need to go back to the good old days when we had a nice impasse, where the two-state solution was, around the corner any day now, maybe the rejection of this impasse should be taken on, even by the Palestinians themselves, so as to say, okay, is there something we can negotiate for that is better than a state? Not necessarily the Israeli ethno-state, or any ethno-state for that matter. No, to me, Netanyahu has not come up with a good answer at all, even as if there has been something, I'll say, unavoidable about the rejection of liberalism as we've known it.
Well, I'm interested to hear your thoughts on, I mean, my view of it is essentially that, people often talk about sort of like the financial stake in something like maintaining Israel, that the United States has, and this has to do with arms sales and investment. I mean, this is often what people are critical of in the West, is that you're not you're not fighting in the IDF, but part of your tuition at your university goes to pension funds. The pension funds invest in Israeli, what are essentially crown corporations or futures that are related to oranges that are grown in Israel, these kind of things, and in this crazy sort of roundabout way. And now, I mean, as we speak about in every episode, the financial contract has broken down basically everywhere. Internationalism, globalism, whatever you want to call it. I mean, we often talk about, we have this sort of zombified version since 2008 that's held up very, very precariously, basically is not working. That there's a dimension that can't be ignored, that Israel almost had to, bunny hop this version of it and turn it into sort of an outright moral conflict, that, if we're not here, if we're not defended, there's going to be barbarism. I mean, that's sort of the reason why the Nova Festival is almost such a perfect representation of this, is that, it's as if they forced the world to forget that there were once Palestinians on that land, living in whatever communities they were, is that, if Israel is on this land, there's going to be a music festival where people have this beautiful, whatever, hedonistic, free, liberal lifestyle. And if Palestinians are here, murder, rape, et cetera, almost forcing that itself to be the conflict, not that massacre was a symptom of the conflict itself, which is kind of a more difficult thing to argue against, right? Obviously. But unfortunately, it's been very effective for them to turn it into this conflict. I mean, this is why we see it, I think, in these ways, affect people in the West so much, is that on both sides, they feel so incredibly guilty. I mean, isn't it interesting that it's really America where you see this super, super intense Zionism? It's often like Christian Zionism. So it's people who are not even Jewish, who have no cultural, religious, ethnic, any attachment to this, see it as this bastion, and are able to, no matter what their, kind of strange pastiche of values is, ascribe it to this nation because they've moved past the sort of liberal financial order. And in the same way, it almost feels like the people on the other side, the sort of pro-Palestinians, are in some ways still trapped in this, divest, here's where the money's going, follow the money trail. And unfortunately, you see that the sort of pro-Zionist side is so much more effective and is so much more, is better at catalyzing action. And it's unfortunate to see that.
I think you're right for the most part. I mean, I think the debate is what kind of symptom something like the Hamas atrocity is. Obviously, that's what the debate is. And so I don't see it as Israel sort of made a strategic decision to turn it into a moral conflict. I think that the moral conflict that emerged once you exploded the naive contract of sort of quote-unquote neutral international conflicts, which are often cynically reduced to questions of resources or in that sense, I think that the moral dimension emerged much more unconsciously, much more symptomatically.
Certainly. Well, I don't think that a bunch of Israeli officials made the decision that we have to turn this from a logical into an emotional thing, but that's sort of what ended up happening post.
Right, and so the reason it happened is because those Christian Zionists you mentioned, I think you're right in saying they are weirdly on the side of something post-financial, post-2008. Okay, 2008 was a particular year, pandemic was a particular year, the many other years can be given and other statistics for describing the breakdown of the quote-unquote liberal order, whereas definitely, say, your classic American leftist seems to weirdly stand on the side of finance on the good old days when finance just naively ruled the world. And maybe this is what explains the total ineffectiveness of the American left on the subject of Palestine. All of their hysterical protests have basically led to nothing but further forms of fanaticism, which seem to be totally disengaged from what the actual conflict is. And the reason, as far as I can see, is because this is not a situation in which a clever reference to finance dominating the world will succeed. This is the whole point. The intervention here of someone like the Israelis and who have sort of taken the kind of accidental role of being the ones to question the liberal order, which has reached its natural conclusion, and now they won't even go along with the Americans. So, in other words, it's not simply this old paradigm of the last good democracy in the Middle East, which has often been the way that Israel has been touted.
Right.
And it's also worth mentioning that sometimes Christian Zionists are accused of a kind of veiled anti-Semitism, in that they just want the Jews to sort of go over there, have a state, and not necessarily be in the Christian empire that is the United States. Of course, this is to me an old paradigm and not necessarily applicable, because the whole point is that there is a frustration with the liberal and quote-unquote financial order. And there's no question that someone like Trump embodies this in a massive respect. And, the attempt to go post-financial means desperate attempts to reindustrialize, radically domesticate manufacturing, use tariffs as a political tool in order to reorganize global trade, in a sense, engage in a process of deglobalization. I mean, this is the slightly more maybe more ruthlessly economic variety, as opposed to the sort of moral ethno-state, exploding, naive, liberal multiculturalism variety. But it stands against something like, European Union technocratism, which is a radically financialized phenomenon. I mean, they have a sort of unconscious political arm, unelected officials who make all the major decisions, but it's a monetary union exclusively, which in really crucial respects highlights the nature of this division. But now why the left won't just say, okay, this reference to financialism and the financial order is not good enough, because even those who traditionally were in favor of organizing the financial order are desperately trying to reimagine it. Oh yes, sure, to continue it in some ruthless way, but they are having to take these detours for the sake of reconstructing a new global consensus. And in some cases, it's a very violent one, or in other cases, it involves a whole new set of vocabulary, such as we see from Trump's entire economic agenda. This goes to our next topic, which is the big tax plan was passed. Trump's tax plan, the great bill or something he calls it, was passed in the House of Representatives yesterday, or sort of this morning, like 4 a.m. Now it goes to the Senate, of course. But it's a giant, it's like $1 trillion tax cut, and or sort of, it also involves hundreds of billions of dollars earmarked for defense spending. And in order to achieve that defense spending, there has to be major cuts basically to Medicaid and food programs. And the reason why it took so long to get through the House of Representatives, despite the Republican majority, is that many Republicans didn't think there were enough cuts.
Right.
And one should not underestimate this weird little detail. Like, this is important. This means that, again, Trump is not just a naive Republican looking to cut taxes and, free trade and business as much as possible. Certainly, I think he's trying to get there, but again, by another route. And his route there is an enormous emphasis, actually, on spending in certain respects. We've seen this before. Even neoliberal agendas going in the 1970s, 1980s, American administration saw massive defense spending, for instance. But defense spending was never in and of itself like an economic agenda, except maybe very implicitly. If you really looked into the details, America has been, one of the great arms dealers, and, people call it the military industrial.
Right. It was somewhat of a necessity, basically.
Well, if not a necessity, it was more, the war on terror was the constraining ideology.
Right.
Whereas what's the constraining ideology now of Trump's Golden Dome, which is one of the signal projects that this tax cut is trying to help mobilize and officiate. The Golden Dome is sort of not unlike comments that Carney has made, not actually least about the Golden Dome itself, but also defense in Canada. It's like there's something about redefining the global contract, the post-liberal global contract, that still involves heavy amounts of defense. But one should maybe go to the end here and say, it's sort of defense as a way to synthesize and or stimulate an absent economic center. If your economy is no longer going to be globalized and financialized, well, what are people going to do? I mean, in this sense, and it's often called military Keynesianism, and this has been the assessments generally of the giant, almost $1 trillion defense plans in the European Union. They've been called military Keynesianism. Now, it might be unexpected to say that Trump is being a Keynesian about this, because, of course, you get these massive tax cuts. But in so many ways, I think that he is trying to find, if not exactly a Keynesian contract, some way of boosting economic productivity through these huge kind of national projects, whether, again, it's manufacturing of automobiles or defense. And therefore, of course, you have to come up with the constraining ideology, which in an interesting way is not necessarily set up. That's what remains sort of so open and as yet defined about the Trump administration. I mean, there are obviously intense positions in immigration on the one side, but then it's sort of unclear who exactly the enemy is in Trump's universe, who this defense is sort of ostensibly for. I mean, the Russians and the Chinese are the most obvious.
Right.
But there's also lots of good evidence to imagine that Trump doesn't necessarily have a problem with the Chinese or the Russians.
Right. Well, I mean, this is also, we're seeing him in the midst of these massive negotiations with the Saudis. And it's interesting to see that it's like Trump is able to, for someone who, even in the most recent campaign, but perhaps more so in the first campaign, would rally against the globalists. That was sort of like the Alex Jones when Trump was a little bit more kind of far right wing, was engaging more with, what we would have called at the time kind of the right wing or alt right ideology, which was sort of against globalism, America first, all of these things. Now it almost feels like he's able to play the game in this way, and people are really on board that it's like, well, no, Biden would have facilitated globalism in this way that sort of would have enriched himself and screwed Americans over, whereas Trump is able to do it in this way that's sort of going to bring us all with him. And it's interesting to see that play out in terms of, doing things like, I would imagine, there's a lot of people who would react to that kind of military spending, the way that they would react to us spending money on, Ukraine, for example. Oh, we're sending them too much money, but people here are starving. But he was almost able to convince the base in some ways that that will find its way back to us some way. And also, if we invest in our own defense, then we'll also, some way, somehow, it will enrich everyone, which feels very, very different than sort of like the Trump 1.0, which was that, those deals, if they're negotiated outside or if they have any external partners, basically we're always going to be the loser, or in some way it's going to screw America over. But now it seems like he's just kind of been able to get everyone on board that I'm this great negotiator, this great facilitator. I will put America first. I'll put you first. And it kind of seems like, yeah, it's interesting, to see the actual politicians, because I think that's what you're saying. Basically, there were certain Republicans that voted against it because there were not enough cuts. But it seems to me the reaction by and large of the base itself is that they sort of trust where the money is going and how it's being spent. And as much as we're seeing the rise of things like Elon Musk and Doge and AI optimizing and getting rid of paper and getting rid of all these employees, they're perfectly fine to see that money reinvested. Where it's being reinvested and how it's actually getting to people, I don't know if it's ever made that explicit, but it seems like, yeah, there's just sort of this new kind of power that he has, where there's a kind of trust in that.
There's definitely a new kind of power. I mean, the complexities of the Trump economy and Trump geopolitics are manifold. They're very strange. I mean, the financial class is basically rioting as much as they can against the Trump policies. But unfortunately, how quickly can the Trump transition happen?
Right.
And we discussed this a couple of weeks ago. We discussed kind of the paradox of inflation in the Trump world. It's like, well, depending on how you define what is going to happen in the future, you might get totally different concepts of the inflationary pressures that might affect the economy. And yeah, sure, if those eventually affect the average person, that can definitely sour the Trump administration, even in his base.
Certainly.
This is the political fight. And when it comes to geopolitics, I mean, Ukraine is a good example of a conflict which I think Trump didn't really care for and felt was a product of a failed global agenda. But as you say, his transition for it was to remake, nonetheless, possibilities for defense at home. What remains a little bit, as I was saying, sort of less obvious is, well, against whom? In fact, and it's worth mentioning China in this context, like the critiques of China are mostly globalist critiques. They're not really actually like quote unquote Trumpian critiques. They're mostly critiques that China is this sort of, I saw this as a quote from the Globe and Mail, but ultimate non-market economy,
right,
that uses exchange rates and monetary policy to favor, quote, its own domestic economic position. And this isn't a globalist critique. This is a sort of World Trade Organization critique of China, that they do things like dumping, that they massively disrupt intellectual property laws because there's endless stealing, quote unquote stealing, that you can make one thing and then the Chinese will basically steal the patents, or not even steal the designs, manufacture it, and then ship it back into your country. Definitely that kind of problem Trump would be frustrated with insofar as he remains a free marketer. But this is mostly a globalist critique. The policies that China takes on are not different from Trump's, are not different from Doug Ford's, are not different from fucking Premier Eby's in British Columbia right now. Like, they're, and sorry, not so different, though this is the most ruthless, scary, terrifying example. But yeah, sorry, the Netanyahu administration, which should give us some indication of the danger of this kind of power. But what is it? It's not an alliance, obviously. It's not necessarily coordinated. But it is a frustration with the liberal contract, with a global finance. The problem is, and we see this definitely with Trump and definitely with Doug Ford, is that there's a belief that capitalism isn't working by people who believe in capitalism.
Right.
And so they're taking any measure that they can, whether it's, again, Doug Ford's special economic zones, whether it's the NDP and BC's Bill 15, whether it's any of Trump's measures like his big tax cut bill, and they're trying to get some opening where they're going to be, okay, no regulations, we're just going to have a bunch of domestic resource projects and radically reinforcing the consumption contracts, And what this is going to do is it's going to provide a space in which capitalism can rehabilitate itself. Um, and the paradox is that in order to get that there, you have to believe again, you have to say, like, okay, capitalism isn't working. And yet the irony is that using these kinds of methods, special economic zones, rather than decrying Doug Ford's decisions as some kind of form of political authoritarianism, look, wielded to just rehabilitate capitalism, it's a horrible strategy. It won't work. They themselves are like, okay, capitalism at this point is not enough.
Right.
This is not just even a failure strictly of global finance, it's a failure of the last great chapter of capitalism, which was global finance. And therefore, I still think one should take on these instruments, not as an opportunity to rehabilitate capitalism, but to sort of play the game better than the capitalists who are trying to rehabilitate capitalism, as an opportunity to say, okay, look, even they don't think it's working. Therefore, we do almost need special economic zones, but not just to have, the Ring of Fire or Highway 413, or, to build necessarily oil refineries to connect with Alberta pipelines to get them across the Atlantic, but as as a political acknowledgement that society, even in its most basic structures, have to be reimagined. And that mobilizing, weirdly enough, the exact same political instruments might be necessary, and therefore one should not shoot oneself in the foot in expecting a different program as far as engaging in a massive transition of what society's ambitions and desires should be, but on the contrary, sort of weaponizing just those methodologies, but towards a radically different end, which as yet remains undefined. Again, if we return to the beginning with Israel and Palestine, the Palestinian cause itself remains caught up in tropes of global finance and human rights politics, whereas this is the ultimate opportunity, one, to actually use these kinds of radical political experiments that we're seeing on the right, against the political spectrum itself, and also, two, to come up with, in this kind of chaos and uncertainty, a totally different vision.
Yesterday, a video came out that featured OpenAI's chairman, and then a designer who sort of famously, runs a massive design firm that's heavily involved with tech. It's a gentleman who worked on the iPhone, who worked on the MacBook, who was sort of at the helm of a lot of design of these very, very revolutionary pieces of tech. So they both had their sort of individual companies. Altman has OpenAI. This guy has his design studio. They sort of formed a company together. I think it was like a while ago, which is now being absorbed or merging with OpenAI. Essentially with the goal being to start putting out hardware that seemingly will natively run something like OpenAI, something like ChatGPT on it, that will be powered by it, rather than having a Windows computer where you open a browser, where you go to the ChatGPT website, you type it in. Presumably, the video is somewhat vague. I mean, it was kind of almost a teaser trailer for the company itself. This is what it seems to purport, essentially, is that we're moving towards devices where potentially the OS is AI based, or some kind of base thing. First of all, very, very weird video. It's sort of like these two guys in a cafe in San Francisco. It starts with them talking about how smart each other are. Oh, he's this designer who's been at the forefront of all these things. He's incredible. He's the deepest thinker that I've ever met. It allows him to get here. And then this guy talking about Altman says, Sam isn't concerned with hardware or money or software. He's concerned with society and humanity and problems. And Sam says that, I don't want these devices to be in the hands of just the elite or just the 1% or whatever. I want it to be given to everyone. It's absurd. They booked out a cafe for the shoot, but then they sort of let people still be in the cafe to make them look more human. It's like, honestly, it's kind of sickening. But it's this weird thing where, oftentimes what's pointed to is, the first smartphone was really the BlackBerry, and there was sort of this whole class of early Nokias, BlackBerries, Palm Pilots, these kinds of things, which were totally killed by the iPhone. And a large part of the reason for that is that, basically Steve Jobs and Apple had a greater vision for the smartphone in society than something like BlackBerry. BlackBerry was basically invented by engineers as a tool for, you can send an email while you're flying. So if you're a businessman, you can become more efficient, or you can text someone. And then of course it was, you can text for free, and it saves all these things. And of course the quote from the film BlackBerry, which is excellent, is that, for context, basically the iPhone comes out and the CEO of BlackBerry thinks, this is a data guzzling machine. It's going to destroy your network. One iPhone consumes as much data as 5,000 Blackberries. It's never going to happen. And then one of these chairman of the network says, the problem with a minute is there's only 1 minute in a minute. Whereas, so they can only sell, 1 minute, and then someone consumes the minute. The iPhone, you can download, you can stream, you can do all these things. So then what happens is, instead of charging for minutes actually now become free. And again, we often talk about this, is that, the technology didn't actually make it that much more efficient or any of these things. We sort of just switched it to find new value in this way. So now minutes are really cheap, but data is expensive, whereas it used to be the opposite. That was why BlackBerry was great. BBM was unlimited free texting only on BlackBerry, because they found a way to text using data rather than cellular, basically. But now we have this sort of weird perversion where so I mean, basically what happened there, it can be boiled down to BlackBerry was sort of trying to fit the internet into business, whereas the iPhone is trying to fit kind of business into the internet. They saw where it was going, where people were headed, this connectivity. But now with OpenAI, there's this kind of strange thing where it almost is like so much vision for something that doesn't exist yet. It's like vision, but you're really blind. And then they're optimizing for problems that don't exist yet. We need this hardware because right now it's horrible to pull out a laptop and go on a web browser and use the ChatGPT website. And then I don't really know. I mean, that seems to be surface level, the problem that it solves. But then, of course, now it's what happens when your OS and everything is run through all these sort of weird things. I mean, what if every device necessitated cloud connectivity, connecting to these massive AI data centers, all of these things? It's sort of just like they are creating whatever you'd call the internet. Whereas Apple saw the internet and figured out how to fit into it. They're all sort of like letting something create the new paradigm, and then also letting this thing fit itself into the new paradigm with seemingly very little human intervention, which really read as quite strange to me and quite shocking.
I'm not convinced there is a new paradigm with AI. I think basically the internet is still the new paradigm, and we just haven't figured out how to build a society
100%
in response to the internet. And with every single tech company you've seen, their transformation into these sort of monstrous tech, whatever you want to call them, overlords, is sort of evidence of the fact that they have not really been able to think beyond the constraints, and I'll be very precise here, of economics. And in fact, the example you give is a perfect example of that, in that let's manufacture something. Probably the obvious reason is that they'll have total control, right? Well, they have control of the device. I don't even have to go through Google.
Sure.
I can just go through my Sam Altman device.
Yeah.
So this is the war between the tech lords, and this is a nice chess move, as it were, in that game. But I think one should go further in saying that this is not unlike renting a cafe and then inviting everyone to come in to appear human. In fact, it's not so different from a tax bill that has however many hundreds of billions of dollars earmarked for a quote-unquote golden dome, almost as a way to continue doing economics by another means. We don't have global finance, so we have to continue doing economics by another means. Similarly, if Trump wants manufacturing back, a Sam Altman plant is probably exactly what he wants.
Right.
How Sam Altman thinks he fits into Trump's world, I'm not sure. But definitely there is an effective alliance between the tech owners and the Trump administration as far as the post-liberal, post-financial economy is concerned. For many people, a post-financial, quote-unquote, economy would be a tech economy, where everything is denominated through tech. There's no longer any naive manufacturing that doesn't happen for a tech purpose. But to me, the contradiction is, and this is maybe why one should remain fundamentally critical. I mean, there are many reasons to be critical of Trump, but one reason would definitely be that he is not willing to question the assumption of economy. In this sense, he has to continue to maintain a steady supply of certain kinds of fictions that allow him to ignore that the central challenge of overcoming globalism, liberalism, financialism is to come up with something more interesting than an economy.
Mm-hmm.
And this is, of course, why the tech bros think they've done it. They think they have something more interesting than an economy. But they also are unable to think beyond the naive paradigm of human production and productivity. And Sam Altman's latest device proves that. And these devices, one should imagine, are entirely empty.
Mm.
Like, going back to our discussion about Canada Post and sawmills and trees.
Right.
Of course, there's a certain romance even to that portrayal.
Mm-hmm.
There's no part of reality that does not engage in some kind of structuring fiction. But this really is like, a device that is meant to be something you produce, not something that we produce because it's caught up in a bigger social contract and we have a genuine need for it. And in fact, one could describe the entirety of AI in these terms. And look at the unquestioned assumption of it all. We're going to continue trying to reconfigure this thing called an economy so that even the most interesting innovations in the internet, or to some extent in AI, will become ruthlessly another opportunity for what we call economics and economy to install itself. And, to give a brief description of what something that's non-economic would look like, well, just think about the internet. Think about that description, which I think is very interesting, from the minutes become free. Well, that's the space of the internet.
Mm-hmm.
Werner Herzog, the German director, said, the internet is an environment. It's a pretty good description of it. The problem is that, we liked that for a couple of years, and then about 2005, we eventually, and all the way up into the present period, had to find ways,
right,
whether it was through advertising and more recently through data in its modern sense, which is not the data that I buy,
mm-hmm.
but the data, of course, that I create. And one should not see in data the truth of the internet, but a violent attempt to conserve an economic ideology which makes the internet secondary to it. And in that sense, one sees the naive dream of the iPhone was, of course, to leverage society to create something as great as the internet, not to leverage the internet to continue reinforcing the basic assumptions of society.
Mm-hmm. This has been episode 28 of Radical Priorities. I'm Ben Parkins.
I'm Aidan Clark.
Thank you so much for listening. Goodbye.